of this summer school. I hope you had enough rest to hold on another day. So I'm happy also to welcome Dr. Jureidini for the first session about migration contemporary questions. So I don't have his bio, so I will ask him to present himself.
Thank you. Well, I'm a migrant. I was born in Beirut, but at the age of 2, my mother forced me to go to Australia, and I grew up in Australia. Although I have Arab roots. My father was Lebanese, although I never knew him. He died when I was only 1 year old, and I was brought up by my mother, a Palestinian, in Australia. So I'm very much a child of migration issues, and therefore I have worked on issues to do with migration for many years, most of my academic life. So I did my doctorate at Flinders University in South Australia. I worked for a number of years in a number of universities in Australia. And then in 1999, I migrated back to Lebanon and worked at the American University of Beirut for 6 years. And then went to the American University in Cairo for 6 years. And then returned to Beirut to the Lebanese American University for 3 years. And now I'm about, on the 2nd of August, I go to Doha to join CILE. So the issue of migration for me is both an academic one as well as a very personal one. And today I'm going to do something a little bit different from the kinds of presentations that have been conducted so far. I'm going to go through just very schematically some of the major issues that I think are of interest. These are problems. When I talk about issues, I mean actual problems that have ethical issues attached to them. And so I'm just going to go through a few of these problems and issues with regard to migration today. I'm not going to give you a history of migration, which is the history of humankind. Migration is a fundamental part of being human. Human movement is absolutely fundamental. It's a question of how we interpret that and how it works throughout history. Migration is not just one form of migration. Migration has a number of different types. We can talk about internal migration, that is migration within a country. That traditionally has been usually from rural to urban. The modern period is very much a feature of urbanization and people moving internally from rural to urban centers. We also talk about international migration, that is people going from one country to another, or global migration. We can talk about voluntary migrants versus non-voluntary or involuntary migration, or forced migration, as some people talk about it. We talk about immigrants. Immigrants are people who migrate on a permanent basis. There have been few countries in the modern period that have actually been open to migration on a permanent basis. The main ones have been, since the Second World War, Australia, United States, Canada, and New Zealand, where they very deliberately targeted immigrant populations from around the world to go there and to work and to become a part of those societies and to help develop those economies. And there'd be different policies with regard to migrants within these immigrant countries. I'm not going to go into all of those issues right now, but just to say, for example, that when I and my family went to Australia, Australia was very much a white Anglo-dominated culture. In 1901, Australia passed what was called the Immigration Restriction Act. In the 19th century, in the United States, they passed an anti-Chinese migration act. In Australia, that Immigration Restriction Act came to be known as the White Australia Policy. That is, it was to be whites only. That was a decision made in 1901 with the Federation of the Australian States, and it was a tripartite agreement, meaning that it was an agreement between the government, between the employers, and the trade unions. And it was principally to keep Chinese and Asians out of Australia. By the end of the Second World War, they needed to increase the population. It's a very large country, the size of the United States, but only had about 7 million people at the time. They allowed Arabs in as honorary whites. I mean, they were really desperate for people, so my family migrated as honorary whites rather than, they had to make compromises, which is kind of interesting.
Like in South Africa.
Like the South Africans, yes. Well, all part of the British Commonwealth, you see. Well, migration is a long, long story, and there's a great deal of literature about it. We can look at it from the point of view of individuals, individual decision making. We can look at it structurally, the way in which the structures of migration and nation states either attract or repel or help people to leave, and so on and so forth. We can talk about world systems theory, which I think Ramon's going to talk about, where you have the forces of capitalism moving people around the world from the poorer countries to the rich countries, and the way in which the so-called core countries exploit the poorer countries for their resources, and so on and so forth. I'm sure you will give us a very good overview of that. The particular issues that I want to concentrate on here, and then I will go on to actually give you a summary of a study that I did on migrant domestic workers, because I want to bring in a gender issue, as we discussed over the last couple of days, and to see how you feel about the kinds of things that are occurring, particularly in the Arab states. So let me begin with the issue of securitization. Securitization, I mean, what we know is that the issue of globalization has meant that a freeing up around the world of trade, of goods and services, of finance, of transnational corporations, and also global movements of people, with increased facilities of transportation around the world, quick, relatively cheap and easy. Yet we find the exact opposite happening from globalization. That is, that the restrictions on entry to countries have become increasingly securitized. In other words, borders are being policed much more. The means of entry, visas and so on, are increasingly difficult to get, particularly in the developed countries, which are only really allowing people to come in who have certain levels of skill. So the issues of low-skilled versus semi-skilled and highly skilled people in terms of migration is a major issue. The border controls are increasingly policed. We have the idea, I mean, we have the Mexican-US border, which is extremely well known, all the problems and the brutality that goes on there, and the incredible risks that people take all around the world in order to try and find a better place to live, a more secure place, a place where they can find work and opportunities. But they are restricted because they cannot do it legally through the normal channels of getting visas and work permits and residency papers. So they find other ways. A lot of people around the world are extremely desperate, whether they are voluntary, what we call economic migrants, or whether they are asylum seekers seeking refuge as refugees. Nonetheless, you have what's called Fortress Europe. Increasingly, Europe is trying to control its borders because they find many, many people getting in, whether it's the boats going to Lampedusa, which I'm sure you all have read about, but also the Turkish, Greek, Macedonian border. This is a land border of entry for so-called illegal migration into Europe, and particularly for asylum seekers, Somalis, Ethiopians. It is a way that these people make incredible journeys. I did a study of Somalis traveling to Europe, interviewed Somalis in Yemen. They cross over the sea. Sometimes the boats overturn. Many people die. The smugglers. Many, many horrendous stories of death and dangerous journeys. And they make their way from Yemen to Saudi Arabia. They used to go through Syria, from Syria to Turkey, and then from Turkey into Europe, and make their way often to Scandinavian countries or to England. These kinds of journeys are being monitored. The kind of studies that are being done about them are increasingly being used as security issues. Countries around the world want to know who is migrating either legally or illegally in order that they can profile and, particularly since 9/11, look at and have some sense of control over who is coming in or wanting to come into these countries. So there is, along with this, migration has become a very political issue in most countries. There is a politics of fear within these countries that is fostered. A fear of chaos, a fear of disruption, a fear of changing identity and religion and so on and so forth. And the idea of undocumented migrants, Muslims coming in, and so on and so forth. These are used by politicians, and there is increasing support for those policies to restrict, and indeed the far right are on the ascendancy all around the world, who use the issue of immigrants and certain ethnic groups in order to get elected because of this politics of fear. Australia has signed the Refugee Convention, but it too uses its navy to stop boats coming from Indonesia with Iraqi, Afghani asylum seekers. And they now take them, they don't allow them to arrive on shore, the boats are intervened in international waters, and they take them to Pacific Islands, put them in detention centres there, and so on and so forth. This is all kind of new, but again used as a political tool for politicians and playing on the fears, again, of the Australian population of these types of refugees, which you know, is not in the spirit of the 1951 Refugee Convention. Europe too, the idea of Fortress Europe, have an organisation called Frontex. I don't know if you've heard about Frontex. Frontex is a security organisation. They have by air, land and sea, and they monitor and police all of the entries into Europe to try and stop what's called illegal entry, whether they are migrants, economic migrants or refugees. And there are tragedies that you can read about every day. People who are, I mean, Syrian refugees, Iraqi refugees who are in Egypt, going to Alexandria, getting on boats, risking their lives and sometimes losing their lives, trying to get over to Italy or to anywhere into Europe. Well, you know, the Fortress Europe is kind of interesting because Europe is now at a stage where it is actually looking very systematically for future migrants. Europe has an aging population, which means that they are not reproducing at a level that will reproduce the workforce needed for the future. Fertility rate is low, so when the fertility rate is low, they need to bring in migrants. They are systematically looking around the world as to where they can bring in migrant labour from other countries, and they have been looking very specifically at the Middle East. And yet, they're still being very, very cautious. I don't know if you heard about, there's a film, I haven't seen it yet, but I've seen a trailer for it, of Palestinians and Syrian refugees who entered into Europe through Turkey, and they wanted to get to Sweden. But to get through all the checkpoints and so on and so forth, they devised a plan that they would pretend that they were a wedding and a wedding party. And they filmed the whole thing in order to say, well, look, people at the border are not going to question a wedding party. And so there is this story of this journey to go through all of these borders, even though Europe is relatively free, but they did it in this way. That's a very interesting thing to look at. So the other point is the criminalisation of irregular migration. Now the term irregular is used now instead of illegal. There was a movement that says no one is illegal. And so people now are using this term irregular or undocumented migrants. That is, they are not in the country with valid permits, with valid visas in order to be able to work or have residency. Now, part of the problem here is that they're criminalised in the sense that people who break visa regulations, normally it is a civil offence, or if you enter into a country illegally without a permit, it's a civil offence, but now it has become criminalised. And there is heavy policing, rounding up people, checking papers, and then being arrested, put into a detention centre, and deported. I'm going to come to this again later on with ordinary migration rather than people who enter illegally, because there is also a criminalisation process going on with normal contractual migrants who do have papers, but that's a slightly different issue. And also the criminalisation of asylum seekers. You have different countries have different approaches. Australia has been quite brutal with these detention centres, with Iraqis in particular, a few years ago, where you have people who are indefinitely detained until they can work out whether they are going to give them refugee status or a temporary refugee status. There were stories of, hunger strikes. A number of young men actually sewed up their lips with, and did extraordinary things to protest the kind of treatment they were getting, and children also being imprisoned with them, which is against international law. So these are the sorts of things that are going on with regard to issues of both irregular migration and asylum seekers. Importantly also is what's now being called new forms of slavery around the world, or modern slavery. These are the terms that particularly journalists use in order to highlight what is occurring in many countries around the world, and particularly the Middle East. And that's what I'll be focusing upon. Issues about forced labour, debt bondage, which is where people go into debt, and in order to repay that debt, they have to work it off, earn the money to repay that debt, and therefore they're bound by the money that they owe in order to take up jobs that they may not necessarily want to do. And they're forced to do it for a period of time in order that they can repay that debt. And it sounds very much like the indentured labour system, indentured servitude, that was both prior to and after the period of slavery. And it was used after the anti-slavery legislation as a way of getting around the anti-slavery laws. And of course, human trafficking. And I will go on to talk to you later on about how human trafficking, which was set up, the anti-trafficking unit initiated by the US State Department, and over the years up until more recently, that has focused mainly upon women and children as the most vulnerable, and particularly women for domestic servitude or for prostitution, and the same with children. So there's been a heavy focus upon that. But human trafficking is also broader than that with regard to for labour exploitation. And I'm going to go on to talk about that later on when I talk about the situation in Qatar. Now, gender and migration is also an important issue. Some people now talk about the feminization of migration. What that means is that right now the figures show that about half of migrants around the world are women. Now, this is very different from the past, and they are women who are migrating to other countries to work, but not as appendages of their husbands, but rather independently. And that's a relatively new feature of the migration statistics.
Excuse me.
Yes.
From what year, from what period of time did it start?
Probably over the last 20 years. Yeah. And they are principally the main occupation, of course, for women, particularly coming from poorer countries, is for domestic work. And we're going to look at that.
Eastern Asia.
Sorry?
Eastern Asian countries.
Yes, South and East Asian countries. And the other thing, of course, is migrant rights. We need to question what rights do migrants have. There was a 1990 United Nations Convention, which was only came into force in 2003. It still only has about 47 ratification countries. That convention was to confer all of the rights for migrants, as well as covering irregular migrants. That is, in other words, if a migrant was in a country illegally, they also had rights. A very comprehensive convention, but which has not really received a great deal of support, particularly from countries receiving migrants, who are migrant receiving countries, have not signed this convention. Those countries that are sending labour, of course, have signed, much more likely to sign. And the same more recently with regard to domestic workers, a new convention by the International Labour Organization, which was passed in 2013, still only has 14 signatories or ratifications to that, but it was a specific convention to cover the rights of domestic workers, and it's called Decent Work for Domestic Workers.
What year is that convention?
It was first passed by the International Labour Convention in 2011. It needed, I think, 12 countries to ratify it, and that happened in 2013, last year. There's still only 14 countries that have ratified that. So let me go on to specifically look at migrant domestic workers. Worldwide, the estimation is around 52.6 million domestic workers. In the so-called developed countries, 3.6 million. This is ILO figures for 2013. These are estimations, by the way. There are no precise figures. Latin America, 19.6 million. Asia Pacific, 21.5 million. Eastern Europe, 0.6 million. Africa, 5.2 million. And the Middle East, 2.1 million. I believe these are probably, the real figures are probably larger than these, in order to take into consideration women who are there illegally.
Will they manage for leaving the areas, or
there in these countries. In other words, these are domestic workers in these countries. The large majority of them are migrant workers who have come from other countries to work as domestic workers in these regions. Well, I did a study, just to give you a little bit of a background. For many years, I was one of founders of an organisation in Melbourne in Australia called the Australian Arabic Council. We set up this council in order to counteract anti-Arab racism in Australia. And we were very, very active. And there were a lot of demonisation of Arabs and Muslims in Australia. And we set up this organisation to counter that. We did a lot of work, media work, television, radio, newspapers and so on, to attack people who were anti-Arab. When I went to work in Lebanon at the American University of Beirut, just reading the newspaper every day, I was suddenly struck by the stories about migrant domestic workers in Lebanon and the incredibly harsh treatment that was being publicised of what was happening to them. And suddenly I realised that there was Arab racism. It was a kind of a shock, although I should not have been quite so naive, I suppose, but I felt obliged at that point to follow through this issue to try to understand what is Arab racism against whom. And the domestic workers was a perfect example. No one had been studying, there had been journalists writing about these domestic workers in Lebanon, and Lebanon began to be getting a very bad reputation as a result. The principal nationalities of domestic workers in Lebanon at that time were Sri Lankans, by far the largest, Filipinos and Ethiopians. In fact, this is an estimated population of so 150,000. It was quite large in a small country like Lebanon. The mixture changed after 2006, after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, where there were, mass evacuations, not only of citizens who had dual nationality, but all nationalities were evacuated during that invasion, including domestic workers. Some 30,000, 30 or 40,000 domestic workers were evacuated. In fact, the story is that the European Union gave the International Organization for Migration some 11 million euros to get the Sri Lankans, Filipinos and Ethiopians back to their home countries. Why did the European Union fund this? To prevent them from going to Europe and seeking asylum. In other words, to keep third country nationals away. So they bussed them through Lebanon into Syria to Damascus, where they had charter flights to their various countries. As they were sending them by buses, they had a direct line to the Israeli military, who were then advising them when it was safe for the buses to travel. So the populations of domestic workers changed somewhat. These are the permits issued in 2010 that shows you that many more Ethiopians came in, even though there was a ban on Ethiopian women at that time, before 2006. And the introduction of Bangladeshi women. Bangladesh had a ban on sending women abroad, and particularly to the Middle East, until this time. It's now opened up. Sri Lanka's much less, but more Nepalis coming in from Madagascar and other, particularly Francophone African countries as well, from Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, and so on. Well, going back to the sample, I actually did a survey of 610. These were 610 interviews with migrant domestic workers in and around Beirut. principally. Now, it was a difficult exercise because domestic workers in Lebanon, as elsewhere, are under certain restrictions, extreme restrictions in fact. They are required to work or live in the household that they're working, and they are not allowed out unless they get permission to leave the household. There are many stories of women actually being locked in the house while the family is away. They're not allowed out on their own. And they're only allowed out if they may be accompanied by a member of the family. Which means that getting access to these women is extremely difficult. But we did this survey. I used Sri Lankans, Filipinos, and Ethiopians. I trained them to do the interviews, to conduct questionnaires, and they did it under often extreme circumstances. Just to give you a kind of a profile, which gives you an indication. By the way, this study could be replicated in any of the Arab states. We would get exactly the same results with only a few variations. In fact, I did a survey, a much larger survey in Cairo, and I'll mention what happened in Cairo in a moment. So you have Sri Lankans, the majority were actually married. Filipinos were more or less half and half married and never married. But the Ethiopians, 81% were never married. And you will also see that that they had a high proportion of Sri Lankans and Filipinos also had dependent children. So they are there mainly to earn money to send back to their families and to their children. I visited, some years ago I visited Indonesia. I was invited by a women's NGO to talk about domestic work. As many Indonesians, although very few Indonesians are in Lebanon, they are very numerous in the Gulf states. And I went to see them and actually talked to returnee women who told me all kinds of stories. Stories that were tragedies, I mean very severe tragedies, and also success stories they wanted to show me. And there was a woman, I visited her house, and she had a very beautiful house. The money that she earned in Kuwait had extended her home. She was able to send her 3 children to school. They all got degrees, and they were working. And I met a couple of her daughters. They were very well dressed. They became middle class. And I spoke to her and I said, well, you know, it was wonderful. And I said to her, how long did you work? She said, 20 years. I said, how often did you return? Oh, once every 3 years for about a month or 2 months. I said, but so that means that you really missed out on your children growing up. And at that point, I wish I had never said that, because at that point, her tears just flowed. She just cried because that was her experience. She sacrificed her ability to bring up her children for the financial benefit to give them opportunities later on. But she missed out on caring for her children. And that was the success story. One of the interesting things of Lebanon at that time was the particularly numerous Sri Lankans doing domestic work. It was interesting that in Lebanese, what happens with domestic work, as with many occupations, low-paid occupations or low-status occupations, is that they become racialized. Lebanese women stop doing this kind of work, will refuse to do this kind of work. In fact, the position of a domestic worker came to be known as a Sri Lankiyi. And there was a boy at school was overheard to ask his friend, is your Sri Lankiyi a Filipino? So you have, this suddenly becomes very deep, and we'll talk about the effect of having foreign migrant workers in the household and also helping to bring up and care for children. And in the Gulf states, there's been a tremendous reaction against that for various reasons. But here you had many thousands of Sri Lankans who are Buddhist. Their religion was never acknowledged in Lebanon. There was a church, actually, a Catholic church, that put a little shrine outside of the church itself in the grounds to allow Sri Lankans to come in and pray. But they were very, very cynical about it. I spoke to them about it. I wasn't very happy about the way they did that. They was very offhanded, rather than being decent about it. The age groups is interesting. So you see, women are travelling from these countries really at childbearing and child-rearing years of their lives, between 21 and 30, 35, 40. And you'll see that the Ethiopians, 90% were in the 21 to 30 range. In fact, they were at the lower end of that age range. So they were quite young. And in fact, the fact that they were unmarried and young is interesting, because in 2004, the General Security of Lebanon, part of the internal security forces, who are responsible for all foreigners in the country, put a ban on Ethiopians. They stopped allowing Ethiopian women coming into Lebanon. They publicized that it was because the agencies were charging Lebanese employers too much. That was actually not true. The real reason was because they had discovered that many of these Ethiopian young women were actually working also as prostitutes, and they wanted to stop that. So this is what happens often is that harsh treatment by the employers sometimes means, well, quite often means, the domestic worker runs away or leaves the household and tries to find work elsewhere. Under the kafala system, this is illegal. As soon as the domestic worker leaves the household, she becomes an illegal alien, and she can be arrested, she can be put into a detention centre, fined and deported. And there is all kinds of brutality that can occur to her in this process. There's always this threat of violence against them. But many do run away, but they work illegally in various places. But they live together on their own, and they work during the day in various households, and they can make more money doing that. They have a level of freedom, but always with the threat of being arrested. By the way, the idea of running away or absconding, this is a very typical concept for all migrant workers throughout the Gulf states. It's the same kafala principle for construction workers or even engineers and so on. If you leave your employer without permission, you are rendered to be an illegal alien. Education. Here you can see that the Sri Lankans were far less educated than any of the others. If you see now the second thing, you see the Filipinos far more educated. We even had professionals. I mean, the salaries in the Philippines were so low, or if they could not get a job, many who were well educated would go to another country to work as a domestic worker. Now, the hours of work. Domestic work is a unique occupation. There's no other kind of occupation that is similar to it in the world. Because it is working in the private households and within families, for families, and all of the dynamics of the families, their culture, their emotions, and so on and so forth are very, very intimate. The household is an extremely intimate and emotionally charged space. So here, the fact that they are not allowed to leave the household without permission means that they work very, very long hours, far more than any of the international labour standards, or even the standards of labour law within these countries. But there is no regulation. Why? Domestic workers in Lebanon, in Jordan, Jordan has changed now. Jordan is the only country where this doesn't occur. But in all of the Gulf states, domestic workers are explicitly excluded from labour law. They are not protected by the labour law. Same in Egypt. And it's very, very interesting to ask why. Why are they specifically excluded? It's because it's not recognised as a proper employment relationship. It's not a proper employer-employee relationship. It is seen as a personal relationship. Because she is privy to the secrets of the family. And for her to go and work for another family next door or a neighbour means a fear that she will tell the secrets of the family to somebody else. Right? This is a fear and a culture of fear that exists throughout the Gulf states. And not just with domestic workers, but with other migrant workers also. And they have put in laws to try and to prevent that. So they work very, very long hours. Some said they work 24 hours a day because they are always on call. Right? They can be woken up and asked to do something in the middle of the night. 34% said they never have any time off. 42% once a week. And so, again, breaking all the international rules of labour standards.
Time off or day off?
Time off, but sometimes it's not even a whole day. In fact, Lebanon has changed now. There's been a much more liberalisation. You see many, many domestic workers, but only on a Sunday. On a Sunday is usually the day that they're allowed out to go for prayers and spiritual practices, but usually not the whole day and not overnight. Another thing that we discovered is that these workers are kind of trapped. Once they're there, the employer can withhold their wages. They can't do anything about it. And what often happens is they say, well, this is like in the indentured system. They take money from their first 1 month, 2 month, 3 month salary to pay the recruitment agency. It's totally illegal. It's against ILO regulations. But my estimation, this is back in 2006, was that just the agencies themselves are taking $4 million away from these workers' pockets with no rationale. Now, with regard, we asked, so how are you treated? Have your employers yelled at you? 48% said no, 52% yes, said yes. They yell. Who mainly yells? The female employer. 75% they yell at you. Well, sometimes they are told, look, don't worry about it. In Arab culture, Arabs yell, right? But they come from a culture where actually yelling is often frowned upon. It's something that's very abhorrent to them, and they have to learn.
Lebanese are very nice. Probably it's high in other countries.
Yeah. Look, all of these figures are understated. Why? Because the harshest cases we did not get to, right? And often when there are, I dealt with many, many cases of domestic workers being burned with a hot iron, with cigarettes. They break their bones, put them under a scalding hot shower. Really torture. I've seen and interviewed some of those women in tragic, tragic stories. Why does this happen? We need to look more closely and have some answers. It's very, very important. Name calling. Dr. Tariq yesterday was talking about racism. here we can see this in the way in which they're treated and talked about. I'm not going to say these words because some of you may be offended, I don't know, but it's important, I think, to see and hear the kinds of things that, that are said to them. You know, the most common was hamara, right? But others, and in Cairo, my study in Cairo it's slightly different. The main domestic workers in Cairo or in Egypt are Egyptians. But you also have a large number of refugees doing domestic work. Refugees from Sudan, from Ethiopia, from Eritrea, from Somalia. That's the only source of income that those refugees in Egypt have. And it created a problem because it's usually the women that do that work, and their husbands, if they were with them, could not find work. And so it created a tension because his masculinity of not being a breadwinner was challenged. Right? So there are many stories about that.
You don't mean,
but you can see the kind of racist...
You don't mean Egyptians here, I think.
Sorry?
You don't mean Egyptians here, I think.
Egyptians are saying to the African domestic workers these names. Abd, Kalb, and Aswad. Right? And the Egyptians are saying to Egyptian domestic workers.
Oh, I see. Egyptian domestic.
Yes.
But maybe you may precise the race of the Egyptians, because black Egyptians do exist.
Yes.
So,
No, but these are not migrants, right?
They are. The Africans were all refugees, or asylum, except for one group, which was the Ugandans. The Ugandans were basically economic migrants. But the same stories of treatment occurred. But they were relatively freer because they usually did not live in a household. Except for the Ugandans, the others. Oh, sorry, the Nigerians. Have your employers physically hit you? 14% said yes. Again, there's often people will not say yes, even if it happens to them because of the shame attached to this kind of treatment. And 61% was the female employer using physical violence in their own. And sexual harassment. Okay, we had 7% said that they were sexually harassed in one form or another. And that, you know, again, issues about sexual harassment, usually people do not come forward to say it. So we asked, do you know of others who were sexually harassed? And so that 7% goes up to 23%. That's not a very precise thing because it might be the same people that they know about who are being sexually harassed. Nonetheless, it gives you an indicator that a lot more of it goes on. Indeed, you know, in countries of origin, there is a belief, this was studied in Sri Lanka, for example, that the men in Sri Lanka believe that the Sri Lankan women who go to the Gulf states, who go to the Arab states, and particularly the Muslim states, that their women are going there and being employed not to work as cleaners and nannies and so on, but rather as sexual slaves. They believe that that's what actually occurs. And in many instances, it does occur. But there's a strong belief that that's the only reason why they're there. And I'll tell you a story. When I was in Indonesia, I was giving a talk in one of the regions that they took me to, in a municipality. And the mayor gave a speech, and I gave a talk, and there were many, many hundreds and hundreds of people. And all of a sudden, a woman came from the back of the crowd with a baby and stood in front of me and said, I was a domestic worker in Kuwait. I was raped by my employer, and this is the child from that rape. And then she went and sat down. And then another woman came with exactly the same story with her child, and then another woman came with her child, exactly the same story. I was a bit, this was not scheduled, and I didn't know what to say, so I was expected to say something, so I thought I would say something positive. I said, well, at least you've come back to a community that will support you, the fact that you can come out publicly and talk about this. But on the way to the next venue, I asked my translator, I said, it was funny when the woman came, a lot of men over that side started laughing. And I didn't think it was very funny. Why were they laughing? She said, well, they laughed when she said she was raped. In other words, they believed that she was not raped, that it was a consensual sexual relationship. So I was wrong. They did not come back to a supportive community at all. There were many, many Arab Indonesian children in that area. And that study has yet to be done. I'm writing that up, and I'm going to be calling it biological remittances, which has not been acknowledged. It happens with Sri Lankans and Filipinos and so on. It's the kind of an untold story about what happens. The types of sexual harassment were these kinds of things, including rape and so on. Many are allowed to leave the house, but only accompanied. Many don't even have their own room to sleep in, although many do. Apartments often build in a maid's room. That maid's room is usually of inferior status, inferior quality of everything to distinguish. And many live in very precarious circumstances in the household. Usually the passports are, I've run out of time.
We started late, so it's
Oh, okay, thank you, I'm sorry. 99% of passports are held by the employer. This is a restriction of their freedom. It means they can't leave. In any case, in some ways it doesn't matter because they still need the approval of their employer, their kafil, to leave the country. The same in Qatar requires an exit visa by the kafil in order to be able to leave the country. So, but this holding of the passport is a big issue. And even in Qatar, for example, there is a law against it, but it's not policed. They still hold the passport. So these are slavery-like practices. Violence or the threat of violence, restriction of freedom of movement, and labour exploitation. There is also a biopolitics occurring by the state with regard to the kafala sponsorship system. They're required to live in the household. They're not allowed to arrive pregnant. There are pregnancy tests before arrival. And they're not allowed to get pregnant. If they get pregnant, they will be deported immediately. Here's some photographs. This is a photograph I took in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, in a training centre for domestic workers about to leave to go and work in the Gulf states. So here they are in this fairly confined space. And over on, oh, sorry, I can't see that very well.
It's pretty good.
That's one.
Yeah, it's one.
Can you see it? It would be better with these lights off, I think.
Go back to the other side.
I mean, one.
Keep on trying.
Yeah. It'll be fun. Oh, that's better.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. No.
Gonna make all
It's,
that. Is it better now?
that's okay. These are training and pre-departure orientation seminars that they are given, which are pretty short, and they really don't know what they're getting into. One of the great complaints from women in Bangladesh and Indonesia, for example, is when they are treated badly and poorly. When I've interviewed them, they say they're so shocked, they were so shocked that Muslims, for example, would treat other Muslims in this way. it became it's a big issue. This is in the Philippines, and training for how to set a table and so on. What's interesting is that there is a male who's teaching them about domestic work. And this is a poster in Bangladesh showing that, you know, these are migrant labour export countries. They facilitate workers going abroad to earn money and for them to send that money back to their countries. These are the remittances. Remittances are now crucial for these countries. They are larger than their trade debt. That it is the largest source of foreign currency earnings. In Bangladesh in 2010, $10 billion came into the country as remittances from migrant workers. Right? So it's very, very crucial. And of course, Western Union, to facilitate these remittances, is present in all of these countries, the sending countries, in the ministries, in the training centres. They're always advertising. They make billions of dollars from the remittances from the commissions that they take, which sometimes is very, very high. This is Beirut Airport. You know, they come into the airport, they're taken immediately in a very military fashion. They go through a separate passport control. They then go to the General Security Office and they wait there until the employer comes to pick them up. The employer is given their passport and then they're taken away. I was not really allowed to take that photograph. I was told to stop.
I'm not going to tell them.
Right. So, I mean, you know, they're very sensitive. It's a very sensitive area. Right? And then they're taken away. Now, there's an issue of dependence. I'm sorry, I'm going over time, but nobody else is here to talk, so I might as well just
You don't mind taking on our break? I don't mind, so.
you don't mind? I'll be quick.
Actually, there's 45 minutes break, so I think it's too long anyhow.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
So,
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I've got more pictures yet. Dependency is a big issue. The Gulf states, the Arab states now, have become, you know, the middle class and even lower middle class families have become totally dependent upon domestic workers. The Gulf states, you look at the houses, who's going to clean them? Who's going to take care of them? They have to have people to do this work. Right? And they will not do it themselves. Right? It's a status issue now. And migrant workers and countries are totally dependent upon them now. Right? And let me just give you an example. I was in a place called Dora, which is where a lot of migrant workers go during their day off. They have restaurants for Philippines and Ethiopian restaurants and so on and so forth. So here's a man who arrived with a baby and two domestic workers. One, I think, Sri Lankan, I think the other a Filipino. And he arrived, and they were going to go shopping.
I just want to mention one thing, because I see the boy in the arm, probably of the father or the grandfather,
Yes.
that it's not only about domestic work, it's about also the upbringing of the children.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So in Dubai, I was shocked to see regularly in, for example, the food courts, that the parents would sit at one table enjoying their meal, and the small children were each child was taken care of a single nanny,
Yes.
let's call it like that, just to entertain the kids, to let their parents eat on their own.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, what is actually happening is even more than that. That they also are brought in to take care of the aged and sick. In the absence of aged care, as in other countries and hospices and things like this, they bring in these women who are untrained as nurses. They're really often untrained as mothers and child carers, but they are cheap, and they serve them, and they do all of this work. They prepare them for school, they talk to them, and some of them even teach them their language. One of the complaints is that they're learning Tagalog, right, or Amharic from the domestic worker, and they're not learning Arabic properly. And there are these cultural tensions. We can talk about that later. So they came to go shopping. They're about to leave to go shopping. And as soon as they leave, you can see the baby is distraught, right? So the child is dependent already. This is an issue. The closeness by taking care of these children means that if a child falls down, the child will run to the Filipina and bypass the mother in order to get comfort. How does the mother feel about that? Well, the mother will be devastated. She has lost that closeness with her own child. And sometimes that creates jealousy and anger. And sometimes she will get rid of the domestic worker, send her home, and bring in a new one in order to break that relationship. Others love it. And it's actually quite, I've spoken to psychoanalysts and psychiatrists about this. They think it's very, very healthy, actually, for a child to bond with somebody else. But anyway, that's interesting. Now, in Jordan, the UNIFEM organization, it's now United Nations Women, but it was previously called UNIFEM. They commissioned a famous Jordanian caricaturist, artist, to do some caricatures of domestic workers. And here is one where this idea of he was brought up by the Sri Lankan. So he's been away, he comes back, and he bypasses his mother and runs straight to the domestic worker saying, "Mummy, mummy." And sometimes I have heard children call the domestic worker mama or baba. This is a famous photograph in Lebanon after the assassination of the demonstrations after the assassination of Hariri, where this woman brought a Sri Lankan domestic worker to the demonstration, forced her to hold up a flag and start singing and the slogans, "Get Syria out." I mean, she knew nothing about what was going on, but she followed along, right? The servant.
She's political worker now.
Yeah. Now, this is a really important caricature that has a lot in it, where she says, look, she's all bandaged and beaten up by her husband, and she says, "Listen, I will only tolerate your beating and insults in one case only. Get me an Asian maid to take it all out on her. Then you can beat me as much as you want." Now, this is an interesting assumption that the harsh treatment of the domestic worker and even violence against her flows down from the patriarchal dominance and violence of the husband against the wife, and there's this status hierarchy. Now, I don't think I agree with this. When I did my interviews, I asked them, is there violence between the husband and wife? In fact, we found no correlation between abuse of the domestic worker and abuse of the madame of the household. But that's something that needs to be explored. But it is an assumption. I can leave it there. Oh, I didn't want to show you that one. There was just very, very briefly, Human Rights Watch did and others have done awareness raising campaigns. They used the statistics from my study on this, and they did this kind of thing. They put a Lebanese woman into the uniform of a domestic worker and to try to shame them, to say, have you ever been punished for breaking a plate? Have you ever been called a donkey? Have you ever worked for years without a day off? Have you ever been denied food when you were hungry? And that certainly happens too. And so on. So I don't think these awareness raising programs really work very much. And I can talk about the reasons why, but I think I should stop right here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ray Jureidini. Very insightful and sometimes painful. I remember when I first came to Qatar, I was not aware and not used to some things, and I came to the Faculty of Islamic Studies, and I saw domestic workers sitting the whole day. And I asked somebody, why are they sitting there? And he told me they are waiting for the student. So each student obviously has the domestic worker to take care of his books when he comes out of the class. So they were sitting, waiting, and when the student come out of the class, they were taking the books. And I heard other stories about schools where they found out that the Indian students always took the bags, the kids took the bags of the Qatari students. So the Qatari students paid them with candy, etc. And it was like in the mindset of the Qatari student, the Indian has to work. He has to take the bag, and it's not up to him. And then another case where a Qatari had a flat tire, and he was looking around. He saw an Indian passing by, and he gave them the bump, and he told him, change my tire. So it was just an Indian passing by. So I get introduced to this new things, and I think as a center we want to do local work also. That's why we decided to have this area of research that is migrant workers and human rights, to have also our contribution on a local scale in Qatar and the Gulf region, and Dr. Jureidini inshallah will help us to try to come up with something and do some work on this level. So thank you very much. And if there are any questions about this presentation, we will take maybe a few, because we will start again at 11:15 with Dr. Ramon. So
he's not here. If he doesn't come,
he will come. He will come. Yes, he's coming. So we will take a few questions, and then we will have a 15 minutes break before starting the second session. So, Dr.
Yeah, I have a story also.
Oh, there are a million stories.
It happened about 2 months ago. I was driving, and then a police officer working in Qatar. He's not Qatari, but he's from Arab nationality. I was trying to park, and at that time I had a problem in my foot. I cannot walk on my 2 feet, so it's a very difficult situation trying to park, and then he came and, Rahman, sir, don't you know how to drive?
Mar is donkey.
Donkey, don't you know how to drive? I didn't say anything. He's my neighbor in the same building. I know him, but he doesn't know me. And I was trying to park in my own path. But he wants to answer quickly, and he doesn't want to wait for me to go to parking. Okay. They didn't say anything, and after 2 days I came back. I find him in the front of the building, and I said, Assalamu alaikum. He said, who are you? I said, I'm your neighbor who told me Mara 2 days ago. He said, oh, I'm sorry. I thought you are an Indian.
Excuse.
Yeah. So a few days later, I was reading on the internet the appointment of that Indian scientist who became the CEO of Microsoft. Oh, I forget his name. Indian American. Okay, I was on my Twitter page. Today, an Indian American was appointed CEO of Microsoft, and last week, a police officer called me Mara here, and then he apologized and said, I thought you were Indian. When I put it on Twitter, it gets a lot of interaction inside Qatar and other countries.
Yes.
And then I got a call from the Ministry of Interior in Qatar. Someone called, it was translator, and he said, we read your tweet, and we're sorry for what happened. I'd like you to give us the name of that police officer, because we don't accept it and we want to do writing on this. I told him, sorry, he apologized, and I'm not going to give you his name. And then an hour later, I got an email from the Minister of Interior's Office of Public Relations saying the same thing. And I wrote back to that, I'm not going to give you his name. He apologized. If you want to take to the court, I will talk to the court. But just want from me personally, I don't want to do it. But it's enough that you got the message. Thanks for trusting. My question is why? Oh. This is just an introduction. My question is why? How do you explain more violence from female employer against these female domestic workers? Did you find any explanation for that?
It's an excellent question. In fact, it was an issue that that has rarely or almost never been addressed. So I actually did a little study, because one of the questions I'd had all along was not just that it's mainly the madame. People argue, well, she's with her most of the time, the woman, or the wife and the mother, she is responsible for the house. She has to deal with her. And because she's dealing with her on a daily basis, it makes sense. Well, it actually doesn't make sense. But, I mean, that's given as a reason why she is harsh with her. But then I thought about that and I thought, well, you know, some people do not treat them like that, and some people do. So how can we explain it? It's not a universal issue. So I went and I interviewed psychiatrists and psychoanalysts, and I found that women were actually doing therapy with them because of their violent feelings and attitudes towards the domestic worker. This was very, very revealing and very instructive. And so it was explained to me we need to go into those psychological issues, because if she was brought up with a very harsh, demanding mother, and there's also a culture here of the household, it has to be perfect, it has to be perfectly clean for the husband. I mean, men are implicated in this because it's often being done on their behalf. Right? So there is all of these complexities. I did some reading and I published sort of an exploratory paper on this, to say that the people who are dealing with these issues and providing counselling and services and so on to the domestic workers, they're ignoring the women, the Lebanese women, who also need help. And now that's actually beginning to take place. And now there's been a study of the employers of domestic workers and to look at those issues. There are also mental health issues with regard to the employers, and there are mental health issues with regard to the employees. I've just seen a study on psychiatric treatment of domestic workers in Lebanon. It is unbelievable. But anyway, that's nice.
We'll just take two other questions. Two questions. Who was first?
Actually, all raise their hands the same.
You know The Help, this movie, American movie? Oh, The Help.
Oh, yes. Yes. Yes.
But those who don't know, is about black domestic workers who raise white children, and when they grow up, they do the same as their parents. They will have domestic workers who raise their children. So it was very interesting. It's like a philosophical movie, and how they try to do something from this story. And my question is about, I have two questions actually. Does a study exist about comparing the situation, what you are talking about in Lebanon and Gulf countries, comparing with the Western world, that the West overcome this problem, or is it still existing? Is it because there are more human rights in the West? So what do you think about this? Does a study exist about this? And the second question was about what about the sources of immigration? Should we tackle the problem from the source? Like, why should we think about the solutions or the questions to prevent people from leaving their countries, and what makes that their mindset is still colonizing? It's linked between what we were talking yesterday,
yes.
Colonized mindsets and liberation of spirits. So yeah, how should we tackle the problem at the source, or go to the consequence in among the new slavery forces?
So we had the two questions here. So can you reply on this in 2 minutes?
Yes.
Because we will have enough time, inshallah, to continue this afternoon.
Look, it's complex. Yes, indeed. I've just done a study of the recruitment process for the Qatar Foundation for mainly construction workers. But when I went to recruitment agencies and the government ministries of 5 of the sending countries, and domestic workers was very much there. And part of the problem here is that there's no regulation. There's no adequate regulation of the sending countries. The sending countries are, the Philippines is the most entrepreneurial government of sending workers abroad because it is so important for the remittances. So there have been bans, for example, all of the sending countries have banned sending domestic workers to the Middle East or one Middle East country or another at various stages. But invariably, they lift those bans because it's a buyer's market. In other words, if you can't come to an agreement with Doha, then they'll just say, well, we'll get domestic workers from somewhere else. And so the countries that put on the ban, they eventually lifted. Because these bans and this way of dealing with it, the Philippines government, for example, introduced a mandatory wage level which was too high, $400 a month. Nobody wanted to pay that. But they did that to try to stop the market. But what it does, it becomes what we call a moral hazard, which means that you put in the restrictions, but you know that people still want to go. So they find illegal ways to go. They go through other countries in various ways to get there. That makes them even more vulnerable to be exploited and sometimes pushed into prostitution and so on, because there are mafia around. There's a lot of trafficking and traffickers around who prey on these vulnerable women. So it is a very difficult thing. I think the thing is to have them properly trained and their rights, being aware of their rights and what to do if there's a problem, and the same with changing the culture of violence in the receiving countries.
Shall we will take a 10 minutes break?
It's already 10, 45.
It was 45.
So see you after 10 minutes.